am back in Urbana-Champaign. I about said Champaign-Urbana, but then I saw the University of Illinois down the road, and I was like, oh yeah. When you're in Urbana, they call it Urbana-Champaign.
I don't. I'm from Champaign.
Okay, hell yeah. That's what I say too. So, Evan, welcome back to the show. For folks that don't remember you or maybe didn't catch your first times on the show, can you go ahead and reintroduce yourself to our audience?
Thanks, Cole. I'm Evan Bruno. I'm a partner here at Bruno Law Offices in Urbana. We practice criminal defense throughout Central Illinois, state and federal courts. I have a personal interest in our war against marijuana and other drugs as it relates to, bringing a little bit of common sense and 21st century thinking into the equation. I'm not a warrior in any sense, but I do think that there are forces that are very stubborn, that are kind of bringing, always struggling to kind of pull us back towards Nancy Reagan style dogma of everything's bad and it's bad because it's bad and we don't need to think any further beyond that.
Yeah. And
that's why I'm talking to you.
Thank you for your time today.
Sure.
I just want to, I feel like this is a good place to set the stage before we go anywhere else today. I remember I found you because something to the effect online, it said cannabis defense attorney, and the year was, we were just talking about it. It was 2020 because it was like a little bit after COVID. I think you said before vaccines. I can't remember exactly the timing, but the point is cannabis was supposed to have been legal by then. So I was confused as to why there were cannabis defense attorneys anymore. And so I thought that would be an interesting place for folks that haven't seen our episodes. Can you remind the folks of the fact what I'm alluding to?
The myth of legalization.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I had mentioned this on our previous talks, but I think there had been kind of a understanding amongst people that decriminalization is like a step towards legalization. And my take on it, after having seen Illinois, which claims to be one of the most progressive states on cannabis, what legalization meant in Illinois, it's really, decriminalization is the goal beyond legalization. So what legalization did in Illinois is it basically laid out, it took all of the existing cannabis laws.
Right.
Did not repeal any cannabis law. All of the laws that say it's a crime to possess cannabis, it's a crime to possess with intent to deliver cannabis, all of the laws that said, it's a misdemeanor for this much, then it becomes a felony for this much, then a higher felony for this much. Right. All of those laws remain on the books. What legalization in Illinois did is basically it said, it extended a tightrope out over those laws and said, if you follow these specific instructions,
yes,
and you jump through these specific hoops and you tap dance on these specific steps on this tightrope, you will not fall off into those existing remaining criminal cannabis laws.
Right.
But that's not legalization. Or that might be legalization, but it's not decriminalization because all of the crimes still exist.
Yes.
They just extend this little tightrope out that says, you don't fall into those crimes if you do this little dance and you avoid all these pitfalls. But what that resulted in is a handful, I don't know how to quantify it, but probably a dozen different ways where pretty innocuous, innocent use or possession of cannabis has the exact same penalties and consequences as it did before legalization because maybe you have not stayed on the tightrope as much as you should.
Yes.
And a lot of people, I've mentioned that even since the last time we talked, I've talked with prosecutors about this, and I've kind of explained my position on this world we're living in under legalization. And the attitude I've gotten is like, well, how hard is it to just stay on that tightrope. Come on. But it is hard. And, you know, in the criminal law, you kind of, the system or prosecutors, however you want to put it, kind of expect perfection and not perfectly staying on that tightrope, you know, not perfectly abiding by all those conditions that go on possession or use of cannabis. It's like, well, you're just a damn criminal because you can't just you know, how hard is it just to obey our rules?
Right.
Which has always been the case. You know, how hard is it just not to smoke cannabis? How hard is it just not to like possess it? I don't want you to come crying to me.
Right.
But the problem is we're in a state where we say it's legal. We say we're progressive on cannabis, but we still have more ways now to get in trouble, criminal trouble for cannabis than we did before 2020.
Yes. Yes.
Which is the problem.
Yeah.
So what decriminalization would mean, as opposed to legalization, decriminalization would be essentially cannabis is no longer something to be dealt with through criminal law.
Right.
And there's things you can and can't do. We can debate, you know, how far that should go, but when it comes to something like cannabis, but essentially it says, look, even if you fall off the tightrope, you're not, like, maybe you've messed up, maybe there'll be some penalties that the government will impose, but we're not going to deal with it through the criminal law.
Right.
And the criminal law being the branch of the government that can take away your liberty and can say, we're going to put you in a cage.
Yep.
And we're going to take away your right to live out in society, or we're going to put you on probation and assign you to a government babysitter who, you know, if you don't mind your P's and Q's, can then, you know, ask the judge to put you in jail. So I don't know where that came from, the idea that decriminalization is like a baby step towards legalization, but I think what we've learned in Illinois is decriminalization is like the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
To where you say, like, look, you can put rules on cannabis, but whatever. I mean, I think we talked during one of our conversations about, I wish cannabis was treated more like tomatoes than it was like heroin, but whatever. Okay. So say the government wants to regulate it. Don't put some more tools in the toolbox than just criminal prosecution through state's attorney's offices in the county.
Right.
That was my big beef with what we're calling legalization now.
Yeah. And one of the things you said, it's like, so the tightrope, it's hard to do the dance or hard to stay on the tightrope, whichever, you know, analogy we want to use. Definitely in many cases it's hard, and we can talk about that. But in some cases, my favorite one that we'll be talking about today, it's arguably impossible.
Right.
And I'm talking about odor proof. The odor proof requirement and the vehicle transport, is that?
Right. So it's a unlawful possession of cannabis by a motorist or by a passenger or driver. Now that's even the tightrope arguably doesn't even apply, because that's new with so let me go through the history. There's a law in Illinois under the vehicle code. It's not under the criminal code. It's under the vehicle code that essentially says it's a crime under the vehicle code. The vehicle code is what contains basically any crime that has to do with a car. DUIs, reckless driving on a suspended license, vehicular homicide. Those are all under the vehicle code. When Illinois became a medical cannabis state, before recreational, the General Assembly, the legislature, in its wisdom, created a law that basically said the title of the law, it's a criminal statute, was possession of medical cannabis in a motor vehicle.
Okay.
And that law basically said it's illegal to transport medical cannabis in a motor vehicle unless it's in a sealed, child-proof, odor-resistant container, or odor-proof container. Child-resistant, odor-proof container. When legalization, in quotes, happened in 2020, and January 1st, 2020, there was a new law that applied to recreational possession of adult use cannabis in a motor vehicle. And that law requires that anyone possessing cannabis in a motor vehicle have that cannabis in a see, I should have this memorized at this point, but as of right now, it's a sealed or resealable,
Yes.
child-resistant, odor-proof cannabis container.
Right.
If you don't check all those boxes for whatever container you have your cannabis in, it is a Class A misdemeanor, which is the same level of offense as a DUI or domestic battery or theft. It's punishable by a year in jail.
Yeah.
And most importantly, in terms of how does this matter to actual people in Illinois on the ground, is the most important thing is, to explain this, you got to kind of take a step back. People have their person, their houses, and in today's world, their vehicles, which are areas that, the government usually shouldn't search unless they have a good reason. In the vehicle context, so says the United States Supreme Court from decades back, the vehicles are different. You don't need a search warrant to search a vehicle. You just need probable cause. And probable cause can be probable cause of basically any crime before the police can search a vehicle. Mm-hmm. So with this odor-proof, child-resistant cannabis container rule, if you are pulled over in Illinois for, say, speeding or tailgating or tinted windows or a loud muffler, or, rolling through a stop sign, whatever, and the police officer can detect or say that he or she detects the odor of marijuana.
Right.
That is probable cause that you've committed a crime. Even though it's legal to possess marijuana, it's illegal to transport it in a container from which it can be smelled. So if an officer just says, I smell marijuana, that gives them probable cause to search the car. And another way it could go is if an officer asks a driver, do you have marijuana in this car? They're not asking the driver, have you committed a crime or are you committing a crime? Mm-hmm. Because having marijuana is no longer illegal in a car.
Right.
But if the driver says, yeah, I've got some weed in my car, the officer then might be tempted to say,
right.
I can smell it.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, you've committed a crime.
Right.
Not I think you might be committing a crime, but you've by definition committed a crime because if I can smell it, it's not in an odor-proof container. And if it's not in an odor-proof container, you are committing a violation of illegal transportation of cannabis. And so I've had multiple cases since legalization, since this law has been in effect, primarily out of a certain county immediately south of Champaign County, which is where for whatever reason, where the county sheriff and the Illinois State Police like to congregate to do their vehicle stops. And I've had a gun case and a money laundering case, all because the only reason that these became criminal cases for a gun or for money laundering is because the officer said, I can smell that cannabis. It's not being transported properly. And in Illinois, and basically I think under the U.S. Supreme Court, and I assume in most states, the police can arrest you regardless of how quote-unquote serious the criminal offense is. So they can arrest you and tow your car, and when they tow a car, they have the right to do what's called an inventory search, which means they can toss the whole car and search the whole car. Yeah. That's under the justification of, well, we want to safeguard your property and make sure that you don't claim that we've taken anything or anything's been damaged. So even if the only suspicion that a police officer or a state trooper or a county sheriff has is that someone's violated this provision of the vehicle code, of I can smell the cannabis. You're allowed to have the cannabis, but if I can smell it, you're not allowed to have it that way.
Right.
So if the cop has that probable cause that it's not in an odor-proof container, it's not being transported properly, they can toss the whole car. Mm-hmm. And, even if say the driver were to say, yeah, it's right here, I have the cannabis in this, old prescription pill container, which is child resistant. It's got the child resistant top. It's sealed. Is that not good enough? If the officer says, I can smell it, The officer can then effectuate an arrest, put the person in handcuffs, take them to jail, make them post bond because they've committed a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by a year in jail. And then when they call the tow company to tow the vehicle to the police impound, they can then search the entire car because they got to make sure that the person's property is being safe, being safely kept. So the point of this whole rant that I'm going on is that we have a law in Illinois that only exists in Illinois and not in any other of the 50 states that says that you can possess and transport cannabis in a vehicle, but only if it can't be smelled. And there's no legislative history supporting that odor-proof requirement.
Right.
There was not a single state representative who stood up and said, this is my bill. I've introduced this bill to make it a crime to transport cannabis in a non-odor-proof container. And here's why. No one ever said that. No state senator got up and said, the odor-proof requirement's important for such and such a reason.
Right.
So call me a cynic, I think it's just a skeleton key for probable cause. It's just a probable cause generator for police. And before you accuse me of being conspiratorial or being a whack job who thinks that this is all some dark magic to give police probable cause, I've seen it. I've represented people and taken their cases through the court system who got charged with more serious crimes only because the police said that they smelled cannabis. And not because the police said you have illegal cannabis.
Right.
Or not because you have too much cannabis. Or not because you're high on cannabis. But because I can smell it, and that's it. So that's where we're at right now in Illinois.
Yeah.
And I hope it changes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's insane. And I mean, just to put a finer point on that, something you've mentioned and I've experienced is independently, so I don't think it can be totally chucked up to anecdote. If you've purchased a product from a legal dispensary, those containers are not odor-proof.
Not even close. So,
yeah.
Like Cresco Labs is a big one. I don't know if you want me to.
It's fine.
If you care if I name drop, but some of their cannabis that I've bought before is in a glass jar. It's like a little glass jar that you might like get a cosmetic in.
Yeah.
It's a glass jar with kind of a plastic lid that's got you barely need to push it down to spin it to open it up. Yeah, the child resistant thing is like, I think most 2-year-olds could probably get into it, but whether they can operate a bong is a different question.
Right.
But this is not something that you'd like transport nuclear material in. It's a piece of glass with kind of a rough thread on the screw top and like a kind of a loose fitting plastic cap.
Right.
You put that in your car, even if it's 70 degrees outside, and come back in a half hour, you can smell it easily. And if it's 90 degrees outside, it smells like, Cheech and Chong's lowrider. It's way over the top smelly. And this is from arguably, and I'm not trying to throw any shade on these companies that package their material that way, but these are not like, this is not some fly-by-night back of the trunk drug dealer. This is like the major licensed dispensaries in Illinois still haven't figured out how to make this stuff odor-proof. Now, what's weird and kind of ironic is that I read a lot of police reports as part of my job.
Yeah.
And these state troopers and some sheriff's deputies are insistent that a component of the law is that the marijuana remain in its original dispensary packaging. Yes. They're insistent on this. They say in every police report it was not in its original dispensary packaging. That is just a totally made up rule that doesn't have any basis in the written law of this state.
Right.
But presumably, if that really is what they think, which is not what the law says, presumably if Cresco or one of these big dispensary companies were to start packaging marijuana in like a mesh paper bag, the cops would think that's fine.
Yeah.
So we've got an enforcement problem, obviously. And we've got an education and training problem for the police who think that original dispensary container is part of the rules.
Right.
But who's not getting any shit for this are the companies that should arguably be the most on top of the rules.
Yes.
So it's
and
a
they
mess.
should be at the front of the line and changing these rules, in my opinion.
Right.
And making sure that they're not fucking ridiculous.
Yeah.
That
Well,
we're playing by the same rules they play by,
said you got guys like me who have to write these bills and submit them to the legislature. And I'm happy to announce that I wrote a legislative proposal
Yes.
for striking out that odor-proof language, and it got introduced as a bill. So it's in front of the legislature right now, and hopefully the General Assembly, the members look at them, and they have a lot of bills to review, but hopefully someone, however the sausage is made, someone whispers into the ears like, this is kind of ridiculous. Let's vote yes on HB 1206, I think.
Cool.
Hopefully that changes, but I'll guarantee you one thing. It's going to mean a lot less probable cause searches of vehicles in Illinois.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And if I know anything about the police lobby and the sheriff's association, they're going to push back against it. But unfortunately for them, I suspect there's not any argument against it other than we're going to be able to search a lot less vehicles. Because odor proof, there's no expert, there's no one in the country who could argue that the odor of marijuana is a harm in and of itself.
Right.
So the requirement that you can have weed and you can have it in your car and you can drive around with it, but that's not okay if an officer can smell it, should raise everyone's eyebrows. Why would anyone, I don't know who wrote odor proof into the law, but at some point a bill was written by somebody, maybe a legislative drafter in Springfield. Someone wrote the word odor proof in there. And I suspect, because I'm a cynic, that the reason they did that is because they knew that it would allow the police to continue probable cause searches for marijuana. Yeah. Because if you think about it, let's go back to 2015, before legalization. How were most people getting in trouble for marijuana?
The smell.
In their cars.
Yeah.
Probably. I don't know. I don't have statistics.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that most people who got busted for weed possession got busted driving on the road. Yeah. Not like in their living room.
Sure.
Because it's harder for police to interact with people when they're in their living room. You have all these extra rights, Fourth Amendment rights. They need a warrant and all that. And there's people, their kids might smoke weed down by the pond on the picnic table, and a cop could roll up on them then.
Sure.
But I would imagine, my unscientific guess is that the vast majority of people who got busted for weed in Illinois got busted in their vehicles. Yeah. And so we did this whole legalization thing, and someone very secretly slipped in like, don't worry, the vehicle thing's not going away. Don't worry, police, that's still going to be your main thing. Don't worry, you're going to be able to bust anyone for any marijuana in their vehicle whenever you want. All you got to do is smell it.
Right. It's the one thing that's subjective. There's no question about sealable and resealable.
Right.
There's no question about child resistant. There could be a question of whether or not that's necessary, but as far as the concept, most people get it.
Right. Well, So I think the difference is, it's subjective in the sense that, a police officer, if you want to have a trial, if you're accused of having that marijuana in that odorless container,
right.
Say a police officer says everything's good with this container, but it's not childproof or it's not child resistant. You can go have a trial and have a jury sit there and look at the container and decide whether they think it's child resistant.
Sure.
Or whether it's sealed or resealable. You can't really replicate that with odor.
Right.
So the officer might say, well, I smell it. And then you get to trial. And what do? You bring in some marijuana to the courtroom, put it in the container and seal it up and guess and tell everyone, smell this, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and tell me if you can smell it, if it's odor proof. And then they can say, well, it was different conditions, and the odor-proof thing is pretty clearly to me designed to do one thing, and that's to allow police to continue searching vehicles based on the smell of marijuana. So in that sense, legalization hasn't changed anything.
Yeah.
They might find the marijuana and find, oh, well, this is under the legal limit, so this person legally is allowed to have this much marijuana. Oh, but we can still charge them with a crime, which is it hasn't gotten enough attention, I think, for the way it really, gives with one hand and takes with the other.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about getting the key, getting permission to search. It's then, if we search and we don't find anything, well, at least I have that smell.
Yeah.
So that's the crime there. So at a minimum, even if your search doesn't turn up anything, at a minimum, you can then say, okay, all I'm going to do here is charge you with a misdemeanor, a Class A misdemeanor punishable by a year in jail. Hopefully they did the right thing and repeal that dumb law.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's just insane. And I got to ask, so it sounds like the odor-proof thing is what you see most often.
Yeah. I've seen other iterations of it where, well, here's also, if I'm being totally candid,
yeah,
most people don't know about that law at all, much less the odor-proof component of it. So most people think Illinois is a legal state. Maybe they've learned how much a person is allowed to possess individually.
Sure.
And so they'll say, okay, I got, under 15 grams, or, if I'm an out-of-state resident, I've got under 15 grams, or, I live here in Illinois, I've got my 29 grams, I'm good to go. I'm going to go on this camping trip to my buddy's lake house. I'm going to bring my weed with me. And they might put it in a jar or a bag in their backpack. Maybe it's in the trunk, who knows. But most people don't know that. Most people haven't read that law. As with most laws, most people haven't read the law. Sure. And so, candidly, a lot of the time that someone has been nabbed for an odor-proof or a non-odor-proof container, it's also happens to be like a mason jar, which isn't child-resistant. Sure. Or some other, container that before this rule, no one ever thought was problematic for transporting weed. You put it in a bag and take it from point A to point B. So it's not so much that I'm seeing all of these offenses where it's a child-resistant sealed or resealable container that just isn't odor-proof. Yeah. But the odor is what gets the police in the car to figure out, oh, this isn't child-resistant either. This is in a mason jar, and I would never be entitled under the Fourth Amendment to learn of that, because I would never have been entitled to search the car unless it was for the smell, which is the only thing I can know or detect from the window. Gotcha. Yeah. So the odor-proof thing still matters in every case. Sure. But, the bottom line is, like with a lot of laws, people don't know the law anyway, because who's doing that research? It's not like there's a public ad campaign about here's how you can lawfully transport marijuana. Which gets into a whole bigger problem of just over-criminalization of stuff in general. Yeah. Exactly. Like the child-resistant thing, is it child-resistant for a 15-year-old? Right. And if you've got some flour in a child-resistant container and a 4-year-old gets to it, you think they're going to eat it? Right. Or, maybe if we're talking about brownies, I guess you can think of these hypotheticals, but a lot of this is just I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the thing everyone was worried about with legalization was people are going to be driving around high and be killing people on the road. And so the legislature wanted to go really heavy on the whole vehicle stuff to kind of appease that crowd, which, sometimes that's what it takes for the sausage to get made. But in the grand scheme of things, if you were to put on one end of the scale how many children have been saved from ingesting marijuana compared to how many people who maybe are down on their luck have just gotten fucked by this criminal law. Maybe had to miss work, maybe got fired, maybe got put on probation, got a criminal conviction, lost their license. I would guess that the harm of the law has outweighed any benefit that it's provided.
Sure.
As with many laws. You know, right. Like, I mean, let's be real.
Yeah. Yeah, so the odor-proof thing is something I definitely hear and read about a lot. But one of the other things that you mentioned that I feel like specifically out-of-staters get caught with and maybe confused with is the fact that they have a possession limit that is half of what you and I, as an in-state resident, have. Because, I mean, most states it is kind of standard. First of all, I just want to say that possession limits in and of themselves, I think, are stupid because what does it mean when you exceed the limit? Criminal penalties. Thus, the war on drugs continues. Okay, but setting that aside, most states have a standard of an ounce. We have 30 grams, which is interesting. It's like a little bit over an ounce. I don't know why. But I'm just curious, do people get hit with like either out-of-staters or in-staters? Do you see that at all or a lot?
I've seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, as much as I want to portray this issue in the simplest terms to benefit my position, a lot of the times, you know, someone is committing an offense on multiple levels under the existing like cannabis rules. Like an out-of-stater has 16 grams in a mason jar. So they, you know, they've got the wrong container and they've got 1 gram more than they need. I don't see a lot of those. Because I suspect that it's probably somewhat common for the police who find, you know, maybe someone from Indiana has 16 grams. I don't know this for sure. I haven't seen a lot of those, and I can only suspect that maybe there are cool cops out there who are reasonable and say, like, you know, go on your way, and maybe I'm going to take this and bring it home. But I'm not going to make a criminal case out of this. But yeah, there's under the law right now, if you're from out of state and you have over 15 grams, you're busted for a real offense that has real jail time.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with that is that targets the people who are least likely to know the law. Yeah. Because they're from out of state. You know, I've gone to Colorado, Washington, California, Nevada. And in some of those places I've partook in their legalized marijuana, but like I'm a lawyer. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I didn't like go look up the Uniform Code of Washington and like make sure, you know, I mean, it's a pretty ridiculous proposition that anyone would do that. I can't imagine, you know, if you're a lawmaker or a congressman or a sheriff who goes to some state where there's legalization and you want to legally participate, that you're going to look up their code. Right. So someone from Indiana who comes over here and wants to buy some marijuana and has more than they're allowed to have, this is a theme that I've repeated every time we've talked. It's like, okay, have the rule, but like, goddamn, if they have more than they're allowed to have, and so someone from, you know, Petersburg, Indiana, has 16 grams, and the person in Danville has 16 grams. The rule is one thing, but like, if the rule is enforced through a criminal proceeding that threatens to put the person from Petersburg, Indiana into jail, there's something wrong. Make it a fine-only offense. Or like, I guess, I mean, if you want to make it I don't think you should make it an offense at all. Sure. But if you do want to make it an offense, like, do we really have no tools other than criminal law? Right. You know, give them a ticket. But we, you know, this coming full circle to the tightrope I talked about. It's like, all of these criminal laws still exist. They're all still enforced. They all still are. If you fall off that tightrope, if you're from Indiana and you've got your 16 grams, which you're not allowed to have because you're not a resident, and you fall off that tightrope and you've broken a rule, like shame on you, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But to fall back into the criminal law, the pre-existing criminal law that uses jail time and probation and fines, high fines as a mechanism of enforcement, it's just, we're not being progressive.
Yeah.
Like, we're saying we're progressive as a state on cannabis, but we're obviously not living up to that if our only tool for enforcement is criminal law.
Yeah, it feels very much like smoke and mirrors. Maybe that's not the best way to say it, but kind of like a Showtime version of progressivism. I don't know.
It's like, hey guys, look at how progressive we are.
Right.
You know, that's not what progressive means. I mean, you can give, you can like prioritize giving craft grow license to people who have been incarcerated. That might be a brand of progressive, but it's not like, if you really want to be progressive, stop taking people and imposing the full force of the state's criminal law on them for something that I guess the state's decided is not that bad anymore.
Right.
That's the thing, is it's like, why are you legalizing marijuana? Is it because you've concluded that it's not as bad as we've always thought it was?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so if that's the reason, if it's not as bad as we always thought it was, do you realize that we're still using incarceration and criminal penalties to punish it?
Right.
Like,
well,
you connect those dots.
It's one of the things you brought up in our most previous episode that I thought was brilliant and I return to all the time. One of the first couple of things that you read in the CRTA, the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which, by the way, that's a much better way of putting it. All that law did was helped us regulate and tax cannabis.
Well, at least they didn't call it like they didn't call it like we're done with marijuana.
Right.
Marijuana's tomatoes law.
Yes, or the world's going to be a better place because we legalize marijuana law. Like, they were pretty forthright in saying this is going to regulate and tax cannabis.
It was a pretty big selling point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, but the first two things, like you said, that they've kind of led with in the law, and I'm going off the top of my head, but it's like, in the interest of making sure that public safety resources can be allocated towards things that they should be, for lack of better words. And again, I'm off the top of my head.
They say the war on drugs has harmed people.
Yes,
basically.
I think they acknowledge that.
Criminal penalties for marijuana use have caused a disparate harm to such and such people.
And so,
which is true.
Right.
And
then they say, so we're going to look into regulating cannabis like alcohol. And it's like, this is the question I just wrote down for you. I wanted to ask. First of all, I already know the answer to this question. It doesn't seem to be regulated at all like alcohol. Maybe it's also taxed like alcohol or so. Maybe you can draw those comparisons. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you that I think I've probably asked you in the past, but like, can you think of something akin to a possession limit for anything else? Like, is that somebody has said maybe there's something with cigarettes, and if you bring it from a place with like different taxes, that if you get caught, maybe they can get you with that. But like, is there anything similar?
So I'm a criminal lawyer, so I don't know about like import and export, but I think there's probably a ton of rules on quantity as it relates to taxing and tariffs and licensing and stuff like that. So like in Illinois, I know that if you own a bar or restaurant, you can only get your alcohol or your liquor from a licensed supplier, and it can't be in a bottle more than like a liter, I think, or maybe 750 milliliters. But that's solely for the purpose so that the government can get its cut.
Sure.
I assume that if you break that rule, you're not facing criminal laws.
Right. It'll be like a business penalty maybe or something.
Right. Which is what I've said. Like, look, if you want to tax marijuana, I get it. Like, I'm not arguing that there should be this whole industry in Illinois that doesn't have taxes. But it's, as far as I know, the only industry in Illinois that if you cheat on your taxes by having more than you should or growing your own in your basement or whatever, instead of them being like, okay, this is a tax issue, we're going to like give you assess back taxes or we're going to make you pay a penalty. It's like, all right, straight to jail.
Right.
It's like, it's not like anything else in that sense, where there's these possession limits, but it's not treated as like a business offense or a regulatory offense. It's treated as like, you're a criminal. Like, you need to go to the place where rapists go.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, rapists, like you say, any violent offense, and it's like.
And I know people go to prison for taxes too. I'm not saying that like, I understand that there's a lot of regulatory tax stuff, imports, whatever, where if you're really dishonest and you really cheat the government, you can go to prison. Like, you can be locked in a cage.
Right.
But for whatever reason with marijuana, that threshold is like immediate. There's no like, okay, let's do an audit. Let's like, maybe we can settle this up and like, I can pay you, you can garnish my wages or something. It's like, no, you're going straight to jail, buddy. Yeah. There's no buffer. Even though the offense is when you possess. So for instance, when you're you're a resident of Illinois and you possess, it's a bad example. I don't even know. So like, let's say you're a resident of Illinois and you grow your own marijuana in your basement or something.
Yeah.
And you don't have a license to do it. You're not a medical person, or maybe you've grown a bunch of marijuana and you are a medical, you're allowed to grow it and you give it to your neighbor because you have more than you can use. That's trying to remember where I'm going with this. What makes it different than like another taxable thing is that I don't know. I remember. I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought. So
it's okay.
When you have you violated your taxes, you've imported more sesame seeds than you're allowed to, and you didn't pay the tax on it, or you sold these lawnmowers or whatever, and you didn't pay the tax, or you bought them and you didn't pay a tax or whatever. It's treated as like, hey, the harm you've done to the government is that you've cheated us out of our money.
Right.
And the penalties are typically proportionate to like, you've cheated us out of our money. Come on.
Right.
With marijuana, though, it's treated like the harm you've committed is like Class X felony territory.
Right.
Like you've endangered people. Like, this is a dangerous drug, because we're still operating on all the old laws that existed before we acknowledged that it's not that dangerous.
Absolutely.
So unlike it being treated like the crime you've committed, the harm you've done is like you've made a business offense. It's treated like you're dealing heroin or something like that, which is what makes it a totally unique outlier. It's like in this limbo between a regular old product that's taxed and regulated and like this dangerous stuff that that we need the criminal law, because people who commit these crimes really need to be treated seriously, because they're hurting people. So we've like half committed. It's like if you're doing like if you're like a professional diver and you're at the top diving board and you kind of like get cold feet right as you're going into your bounce.
Right.
It's like, that's the worst thing that can happen. Like, don't go halfway, like don't go or go all the way. But like this little half zone where we're in, where it's like, the people who have, I think we talked about this last time, someone who has a dump truck of marijuana.
Right.
Can do no more harm than someone who has a backpack full of marijuana. Right. And that's not just my take on it. That's consistent with what the government says. The state of Illinois says like, this is something that people should be allowed to do. Right. Anyone who's over 21 who wants marijuana should be able to get it and basically smoke as much as you want. There's possession limits, but like, smoke to your heart's content. And so if you have a dump truck of marijuana, all you could possibly do with that, assuming you don't give it to kids and assuming it's not like poisoned or adulterated, assuming it's just regular old marijuana and you're giving it to people over 21, the worst thing you can do with that dump truck of marijuana is allow people to do something that they're allowed to do anyway.
Right.
And so to treat it like, oh, well, it's a dump truck of marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
The penalty for having the dump truck of marijuana that you're not allowed to have should be commensurate to like, here's how much of our tax money you're screwing us out of.
Yeah.
Because that's the only identifiable harm.
Exactly.
Because the identifiable harm is not that people, now you've introduced a dump truck of marijuana to these people and they're going to, the community's going to have all this marijuana they can now smoke.
Yeah.
Because that's how it is already.
Mm-hmm.
Under the government's notion of things.
Sure.
But the penalty is like, if you have a dump truck of marijuana, like you can pretty much assume that you're going to be treated as like a rapist in terms of the penalties that the law sets out.
Yeah. And the huge thing that I love to point out is that, I mean, we really are, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, we really are playing by two sets of rules in a way. And I know that there are many different ways that you could maybe point that out in our society. Like, it's not like this concept is new, that corporations in many ways have more rights than an individual.
Right.
But just to the extent of like dump truck of weed and stuff, like I mentioned earlier, like, first of all, you're absolutely right. There's actually a report I'll have to send you a link for, where they did a comparison between the transport law for opioids and the transport law for cannabis. And this is like federal. Well, I'm talking federal, not even state, but it did apply to the state of Illinois. And a former DEA person who's now a consultant on these issues, and like a former pharmaceutical employee, both testified to the fact that whenever they transported opioids, there was no requirement. They could throw it in their front seat. They could put it in their backpack and ride a bicycle.
Right. You're talking about like prescription pills and stuff?
Right. If they were like delivering it to Walgreens and
stuff.
Yeah. Right. So they can, that's totally within the framework of the law from what I understand. Like, basically what the DEA consultant said is, if you've proven that you can transport this substance safely to the endpoint, then it is completely legal. In other words, do it however you want, including the mail, and you're all good. Meanwhile, cannabis companies, now I'll give them this, they are more regulated than the opioid companies, right? So in this report, it showed how there's cameras on all the vans that transport cannabis. There's a GPS location that lets the companies know if they get close to the state line. But here's my point. I bet you they fill up that fucker as they just pack that motherfucker full, like as much weed as you can fit in it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just funny that if they got pulled over, they'd be like, well, I've got this piece of paper.
Yeah. It's not nuclear material.
Right. Well, and that's actually what they said, is that it's kind of being treated like nuclear material. Yeah.
The reason why we have these crazy rules is because back in like the early part of the 20th century, the government created this boogeyman stigma of marijuana. Mm-hmm. Could you imagine if everything had been the same in our world, except no one had ever heard of marijuana? Right. It was like a non-existent thing. And then some company, like, I don't know, some vitamin company said, like, we've developed this plant, it's like little green nuggets. You can also make it into like pills or paste or whatever and put in chocolate. And here are the effects it has. And, you know, we've done decades of studying, and here are the, you know, overdose statistics. There's none.
Right.
Here are all the, you know, all the negative consequences and all the health effects and the health benefits. And this is everything you need to know about the drug. And they said, like, we want to start distribution. Could you imagine how weird it'd be if it was like, well, that's okay, but you have to keep it all in a locked vault. Mm-hmm. You have to keep, you know, cameras on the truck. We're going to have all these special distribution limits. We're going to limit the amount of that people from out of state can possess. Everyone would be like, what the fuck? Well, why are you doing that?
Right.
Like, this is a great new thing. I mean, maybe it's not everyone's cup of tea, and maybe there's some negative consequences of it, but like, Jesus Christ, we don't need to treat this like we're transporting like plutonium or something. Like, what are we doing? This is so weird.
Yeah.
But that's the reality we're in.
Yep.
Because marijuana's got a long history, And even though, if you look at it, even, you have so many people, the old cliche, I'm sure you've heard this a billion times, is like, well, today's marijuana ain't what it used to be. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, even taking that as true, it's like much stronger. Like, the more you treat it like it's like, what's like from the Transformers, that little cube or whatever,
unobtainium, I think is what it's called.
Something you're treating it.
Yeah.
I don't know the Transformers movies, but you're treating it like, man, if only the terrorists could get their hands on this. We need to put it in an armored car and like have all these possession limits. That just, all the bad stuff that people are worried about with marijuana, that just keeps it going.
Exactly. And I like your point where you say it's like we're kind of talking out of both sides. I don't even mean to say kind of. We are talking out of both sides of our mouth, where on one hand we're like, this is good, this is fine, you should not belong in jail for it. But
but we're going to treat it like you're transporting.
If you do this, you belong in jail for it. And a point you've made, which I wish I could pull up the text you sent me because it was just so beautifully worded. Something that's changed since the last time we've spoken is that expungements no longer require a negative cannabis drug test, from what I understand. They no longer require that. And I like what you had to say about it. Do you remember what you said? If not, I can kind of give you a rough idea. You were like, you can use marijuana because it's not bad.
But as long as you're not using marijuana because it's bad.
Because it's bad, yeah. Yeah. I think.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I mean, that's the approach they take.
Yeah, so.
And when I say they, I mean, a lot of this has to do with the fact that I feel like if you were to ask individual lawmakers, like, what do you individually think? A lot of them would say, I think marijuana should remain illegal. It's a Schedule I narcotic under the federal law. Who are we to say that they've got it wrong? There's all these negative effects, whatever. Prohibited, we need to make it illegal. And there's a lot of other people, like if I was a lawmaker, I'd say, look, every policy we've ever had towards marijuana since day one has been cause more harm than good. Treat it like tomatoes, make it legal. If people are letting their kids smoke it, that's a different thing. Get DCFS involved. Like, there's ways to deal with all the negative consequences that don't require treating it like the illegal drug it's been treated as forever. The problem is there's not one lawmaker at the Capitol building.
Yes.
They all have to compromise and they have to come together and they have to appease, the police lobby and the growers lobby. And I'm not ignorant to the fact that like you have to make compromises and you kind of have to make sausage to get stuff done. Mm-hmm. But now that we have the laws on the books, we can start tinkering with them to make them make more sense and be better.
Yeah.
And hopefully the people who are holdouts or who are just abolitionists, or I should say, prohibitionists.
Yeah.
Hopefully some of those people start to say like, look, okay, if it's going to be legal, maybe it shouldn't be a crime if it can be smelled. Mm-hmm. And so then we can start kind of pairing, kind of polishing the sculpture we have here to kind of, smooth away the rough edges that make it dumb. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are powerful interests that want it to be a reason to search cars, to go into people's houses, to exact huge street value fines.
Yeah. And I think that, part of it is the possession limit thing, just because I can't think of an analog. I can't think of a thing that is legal but isn't if you have over a certain amount of it. I have to think that not only is it, like you say, a skeleton, part of the skeleton key that allows this criminal justice thing, this what is it called? The prison industrial complex. It keeps that going, can provide for that. I also think that possession limits allow. It's easier to talk about this in the context of the number of growers in the state and allowing home grow. But I really think that they want people to keep a low amount so that, the value of cannabis stays exactly where it is.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me.
You know what I'm saying?
This is like, well, can you think of an analog where there's ever been something other than maybe alcohol at the end of Prohibition, but where there's ever been something that's been prohibited, and it's a widely known, like a popular thing that's been prohibited, that then has been legalized, which gives the government a total puppet master authority over creating an industry.
Yes.
Like it's really
Right.
communist in a lot of ways, because it's the government controlling, every nook and cranny of the industry and supply and demand and
Well, to your
pricing.
point, like, I don't mean to take us too far off, but just to your point, because I feel like it's so relevant, and you brought up communism, so okay, let me just say the point, and I'll back up for a second. But J.B. Pritzker recently defended license limitations in a press conference, and he said, look, I know people have said just give out licenses like you do with everything else, but in states where you've seen people forced to the edge, and they got to compete, And he said, so by limiting the licenses, we are allowing social equity to happen. And so when he said that, that's when I realized, oh yeah, the purpose of license limitations are only to artificially inflate the value of the supply and the license itself. Like, that is the function.
Right, yeah.
But it's really in the spirit of communism, where it's like, and I'm not studied enough on communism itself to say this confidently, but from what I understand, the government picking and choosing winners and who can't be in business is never a good idea.
A planned economy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds in line with communism.
Yeah.
So.
Because it is. I mean, I know the C word is inflammatory, but I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree that, like, the state controls the means of production, essentially, and
Yes.
the government gets to say, like...
The reason I felt if you saw me back up from, like, communism, it's because we've got a few other topics on the docket today.
Yeah,
a lot of people will call, a lot of people will call JB a communist for many different reasons. This is, like, I feel like one of the most valid ones, though.
Yeah, no, and I don't blame the governor for anything he's doing as far as this goes. I mean, he's operating within the laws that exist.
And he didn't write the law. That's another
Right.
important point. The General Assembly did, and it went to his desk. Now he's the number one endorser, and he's constantly praising it. But
Right, he's a company man.
So, any other thoughts on just cannabis itself before we start to get to some of these other subjects?
No,
Cool.
I'm good.
Cool. Well, I guess this might be a quick one before we get to maybe the Safety Act and the assault weapons ban, which I'd like to discuss with you. But I heard you took a peek at the Cure Act, and I just wanted to ask you now. I have to like say this clearly for my audience. I don't know that I support the bill yet as it stands, because I don't completely understand the bill. I've not read the full thing, and so people listening should do that. They should do that. But at a glance, I wanted to ask you about the descheduling component. From what from what the people that are responsible for writing the bill and people that are like kind of championing it, one of the things that they told me that sounds so fucking cool. Look, I'll be straight up in saying that I think the industry component of the bill, aka the legal option, it sounds like they're going to try to do exactly what they did with cannabis. It sounds like that. Now, that's just at a glance. I need to do more research, but let's set that aside right now. I may have a problem with that part of the initiative. So, I feel like I was a little bit vague in this exchange, and so I wanted to take a moment to try and clear things up a little bit. As I understand it, the Cure Act has two main components: the descheduling component, which we're about to talk about, and the supported adult use component. And in this exchange, I felt like I was a little bit too vague, and I said it's going to be exactly like what we did with adult use cannabis. Fundamentally, it's going to be not like that at all. What I meant to say So this is me clearing up, or trying to clear up, what I had just said. What I meant to say was that I get the impression that in order to be an operator in the industry that this bill would create, you're going to need to be politically connected, well capitalized, etc., etc. That's what I meant with regard to the similarities to the adult use cannabis program. The person that I'm referencing speaking to is Nathan Gates. So I reference a person that I asked questions to a few times in this exchange. That person is Nathan Gates, and he was just on the Chill Illinois podcast. It's episode number 249. I put a link to episode number 249 in the description for this episode of the Chill Illinois podcast. Let's get back to our conversation with defense attorney Evan Bruno. This part that people have been telling me about, the descheduling part, sounds so cool, and I just was curious on your thoughts. So really quick, from what I've been led to believe, the descheduling psilocybin would effectively remove all criminal penalties for possession, use, and cultivation, which is pretty fucking crazy because cannabis, we didn't do that. So what are your thoughts on that?
I have not read the whole bill. So here's what I can say. There's the Illinois Controlled Substances Act, which currently, as far as I know, is the only word on psilocybin mushrooms in Illinois. And they're on a schedule, or they're one of the schedules of drugs, and the law has, here's penalties for manufacturing or possessing or selling schedule such and such drug. If it's descheduled, it's no longer criminalized under the Controlled Substances Act, because the Controlled Substances Act only applies to controlled substances that are on the schedule of controlled substances. If it's taken off the schedule, it's removed from the Controlled Substances Act.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing, and this would probably be pretty easy to figure out if I look it up, but I didn't get all the way through the bill. I'm guessing that the Cure Act has somewhere in there, such and such shall be a Class A misdemeanor, or such and such shall be a Class 4 felony.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that it's, for it to be a law worthy of a bill and a name like the Cure Act, it must now impose like a new scheme for psilocybin and for all that. And if we know anything about the way these laws are typically written, the only way to enforce those rules, the only leverage to make sure that the citizens of Illinois follow the new scheme, is to penalize not following it with criminal penalties. So I'm guessing that even if it's descheduled, taken off the controlled substances list and no longer prohibited by the Illinois Controlled Substances Act, it probably is creating its new criminal penalties for violating it.
And to your point, one of the questions I was about to say I had, but it really came from our audience, was if an individual, because that's one of the things they said, you can use it, you can possess it, and you can cultivate it without any fear of criminal penalties. And they mentioned you could gift it, but one of the things they were explicit about was you can't sell it. And again, what does you can't mean, or a limit mean? It means, like you just said, criminal penalties. And so I asked them, like, well, then what would happen?
Who's them?
This person, thank you for asking me that. This person is from the Illinois Psychedelic Society, and they're kind of backing the bill. And so he joined me to explain and try to answer my questions. And that's one he could not answer. He said he had to get back to me on. I said, you're saying people can't sell. Okay, what does that mean? And he said, well, I'll have to get back to you. So I think to your point.
So maybe the bill is just like a free-for-all. But if it's a free-for-all, then what I'd wonder about is, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we can chalk it up to we need to take a deeper look, because that's why I led with that. I wanted to make very clear that we're not complete. I wanted to totally approach this at a glance. It sounds like, though, if what they're saying is true, if you took it off of the CSA, the Controlled Substances Act, theoretically it could be true, but like you say,
if you wanted to make it a free-for-all,
yeah,
you would just do like a control find all for wherever psilocybin appears in the Controlled Substances Act, and you would introduce a bill that says the Controlled Substances Act is amended as follows. And then you have the Controlled Substances Act, and you have a crossed out line through anywhere psilocybin appears.
Gotcha.
That's all you'd have to do. And that would mean that psilocybin is the equivalent of tomatoes now. Like,
Yeah.
you can grow it in your backyard, you can grow it in your basement, you can sell it, you can bring them to the farmer's market. That's what that would mean. But the Cure Act sounds to me, what is it, compassionate use of something or another?
Yeah, something research entheogens.
So if they're setting up a whole system for psychedelics now, or for mushrooms now, there's got to be some teeth to that to make sure that, you can't set up a system like that unless you have penalties.
Sure. Well, and as many
or
people,
incentives.
Yeah, I was about to say the incentives. You can already see people. I mean, in an NBC report, and I'm not saying this person isn't doing good things. I have no idea who they are and what they do. But this person that's running a ketamine clinic already, and it's a really nice looking place, they're ready to get into psilocybin, right? So there's already people geared up, and like you say, there's definitely some incentives. So that's definitely chief on my mind, and sounds like on my audience's mind too, which makes me happy because it makes me feel like we're learning something from cannabis.
Yeah, let's just hope, right?
Let's just hope
that people, the people who make the decisions are kind of self-selected to not be the kind of people who've probably ever done psychedelics.
Sure.
or at least would ever admit to it.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's
a problem with this. So you have a lot of self-selection in the people who ultimately get to make the decision. So hopefully. Yeah, the fingers crossed, that'd be cool. I mean, there's a whole, Michael Pollan wrote the book, Your Mind, How to Change Your Mind.
Yes. About
psychedelics. And there's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of like really good reason to think that it's helpful to people.
Yeah.
And a lot of good reason to think that at least it's not harmful in the sense that it needs to be prohibited as a controlled substance.
So before we move on to the next couple topics, which is the Safety Act and assault weapons ban, that's, I think, a good way to cap our conversation about drugs. It's something you mentioned earlier, and it's something that when you watch, like, unfortunately, like Cops and all that stuff, it's very much a part of our entertainment cycle. You know what I mean? There's literally a show called Cops, and there's a show called Jail. And it's so crazy when you see some kids that look like me or, whatever. But I just identify when I see like another young person, and it's like they're in jail with these people that have like hit their wife or assaulted somebody at a gas station or sexually assaulted somebody. And it's like, really, this is, first of all, it's like not conducive to rehabilitation, but let's set that aside. Like, really, we're putting this person with these people?
Yeah, I agree.
Like,
well, it's culture control.
Yep.
It's important.
Yep.
Not to get too preachy, but
yeah. No,
yeah. I mean, there's not an argument to be made that like the person's like of equivalent dangerousness to the people they're in jail with.
Right.
But the thing they've done is so bad that we need to treat them as just as in need of being punished.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it. Very well said. Well, which one do you want to talk about first? Safety Act or assault weapons ban?
Well, they're both not totally stayed, but they're both they exist in the hypothetical now.
Yeah.
Because, well, the Safety Act is stayed at least until March by the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And the assault weapons ban is stayed in half the counties, I think. I'm not totally sure about that, but
pretty big chunk of the map, though, right?
Yeah, or either stayed or the sheriff said, I'm not going to enforce it. We can talk about the assault weapons ban.
Cool.
Well, I mean, politically, I'm kind of neutral on it. I mean, I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of a difference. Most people, I think, I know that people can legally buy assault weapons, and we've seen that people who can legally buy assault weapons will sometimes do horrible things with them. I'm not necessarily opposed to the ban. Assault weapons are pretty dangerous, and they can be used to kill a lot of people in mass shootings. But I don't. And if I were on the Supreme Court of the United States and the issue came up to me, I'd probably say it is constitutional to ban assault weapons because under most theories, those didn't exist. And nothing even like those really existed back when the Second Amendment was ratified. I guess you could say the same thing about, semi-automatic pistols. But I personally, if I was voting, I'd say it's constitutional. Where do you draw the line? Mm-hmm. I don't think most people would argue that you should have a right to bear, an M1 Abrams tank or a, F-15 fighter loaded with Hellfire missiles. So, there's a line somewhere. I don't know why an assault weapon should be on the legal side of the line, constitutionally. A lot of people have talked about the sheriff's enforcement or non-enforcement.
Yeah.
This is a great window into just how people's positions can change. People's positions on a legal issue mm-hmm. can very transparently depend on their political leanings from one issue to the other.
Yeah.
So basically there's county sheriffs. I think I saw the most recent thing I saw was that a majority of Illinois county sheriffs have come out and said, I'm not going to enforce that ban. And a lot of people from the anti-gun side of things are just up in arms and outraged at, this is a dereliction of duty and they don't have a right to do this. I think the governor said enforce it or you're out of a job, which he doesn't have authority to do. But what people, I think what people sometimes forget is we have adultery is illegal in Illinois.
Yeah.
It's against the law. There's a criminal penalty on the books in Illinois for adultery. It's a crime in Illinois currently in the year of 2023 to possess obscene writings. It's a crime.
Really?
But thankfully our state's attorneys and sheriffs and law enforcement has decided we're not going to enforce that law. It's probably unconstitutional.
Sure.
To ban obscene writings. The Illinois Supreme Court hasn't said that it's an unconstitutional law. Mm-hmm. There hasn't been a case, as far as I can tell, invalidating the whole law. But we kind of trust our elected officials to say, I'm just not going to enforce that law. And that's why we have elections. Right. We don't want them to be automatons. We want them to exercise some discretion. Mm-hmm. And we just spent a long time talking about, police smelling marijuana in a car, and maybe it'd be better off if they just let that one go and mm-hmm. didn't arrest the person. And so this is no different from a legal standpoint.
Right.
From a political standpoint, it is. Politically, a lot of people say, I'm anti-gun. We have a problem in this country with guns, mass shootings. I totally agree with that. I'm just saying legally, the sheriffs can decline to enforce any law they want.
Sure.
It's not something that the people can redress other than through elections.
So I wanted to ask you, I've got a lot of different ways to go with this, but I know that, we're short on time, so I want to be mindful of it. But I'm just curious. So my first question, it's hard for me to think about which the best way to approach this, but it's interesting. What do you think about the idea that firearms are similar to cannabis? Hear me out. You can grow them in your basement. Okay. 3D printer.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Okay.
And, many people argue that it's a civil liberty or whatever. And that's about where the comparisons end, because obviously a firearm is very different than cannabis itself. But on the idea of prohibition, do you think that it's possible to do that, given that it's very similar to cannabis. You know what I mean?
To prohibit guns?
Yeah.
Do I think it's possible because of...
It's like, it's almost like the cat scene. Like there was a time where it's like, well, you'd have to have a milling machine, and it's like, it was a really intense
Oh, you
process.
mean like, you're talking about like logistically, like, can you outlaw them? Well, I mean, you can just make it illegal to have a gun, whether you made it in your basement or not.
Fair. Yeah.
And then if someone shoots someone with the gun or goes out in public with it, they can't say like, hey, I made this in my basement, get off my back.
Right.
But I mean, if you're in terms of like people acting outside of the law, no, we've crossed that Rubicon. If you sent government agents to, search every house and remove every gun, say you repeal the Second Amendment, all the people of the various states vote to repeal the Second Amendment. We no longer have a Second Amendment, and the state of Illinois passes a law that says you cannot own a gun, period.
Right.
And we've repealed the Fourth Amendment, and the government's allowed to go in and search everyone's house and remove every gun. And we've repealed the Fifth Amendment, which, prohibits takings without just compensation. So they just take everyone's guns. So we've done all those things. I guess we could also criminalize 3D printers and then let the government take those. But as long as you have those, as long as you have the ability to make the gun in your basement, there's no legal force that could ever be effective in like eradicating guns once and for all. There's always going to be a drip of guns.
Now that was just like a superficial question. Like really when it gets down to it, and this kind of, you can see where the spirit of my drug advocacy will come into play and everything else. One of the concerns I have about the law is that it specifically carves out that law enforcement can continue to possess and purchase these guns, which I guess I should back up. It's not that people, if you already have the weapon, you could keep it, right?
You got to register it.
You got to rester it.
Which is just like the most, if you were to try to piss off the Second Amendment crowd,
right? Well,
you got to register it with the government.
Yeah.
That way to get under their skin, yeah.
Right. And it's like they're already, I've heard the different perspectives. They're like, we're already on a registry, the FOID. Why do we need to,
right.
And I guess I can get that, but I am kind of curious what you think about that. Like so law enforcement can have it. Former law enforcement can still to continue. Like, what do you have any thoughts about that?
Former law enforcement?
I believe on that one.
I could buy that. I don't know. I mean, I think the law enforcement should be able to have a lot of things that regular people can't have. Access to like databases, even though those probably get abused a lot. Bulletproof vests, riot tanks. I guess I don't know if that's something you need a license for, but
yeah.
I mean,
I think Champaign has one, by the way.
So I guess they do. They called it a tank when they first got it.
Yeah.
That was before that had like a negative connotation. Like,
Right.
Don't tell everyone our city police are getting tanks. But it was really just like a personnel carrier. It didn't have a turret on it with like a cannon.
Sure.
Anyway,
sure.
I think a big Second Amendment crowd, or the thing that a lot of Second Amendment people say is we need our guns to protect ourselves from the government.
Right.
Which is like, I don't
and that's,
I don't
by the way,
reject that out of hand. I think that's
kind of the spirit of that question. Yeah.
Right. And so there's like this mismatch worry.
Yeah.
But it's also, if you take it a couple steps further, it's like, okay, so you are wanting, or you're basically preparing for war in the streets against the government. And also, like, do you know what drones are?
Exactly.
Or like,
it's not even a gunfight anymore.
Yeah. Or do you know what like an A-10 Warthog can do?
Right.
Like in a neighborhood? Like
they could literally just fly over you. They don't even have to engage you with weapons. They could just fly over you and blow your eardrums out. Just saying.
Yeah, it's like it's like a kid saying like, Mommy and Daddy, I need my teddy bear because if there's going to be a fight, I need backup. It's like, okay, that's cute and all, but that's not going to help you if push comes to shove.
That's good.
So don't give me this thing about the government. Now, flipping that totally, doing a 180 on that, it's like, J.B. Pritzker is not advocating sending the police to take everyone's AR-15.
Yeah.
Because he probably knows that wouldn't go very well. That
No.
would be... I would assume that if it was announced that the Illinois State Police are going to go door to door and take everyone's assault rifle, there might be some problems.
Right.
Violence might ensue. And so in that sense, they got a point, that we need to be a threat to the government or else they're going to come try to take our freedoms away.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something to that. I mean, I'm not taking a side. I think there's merit to both sides.
And that's how I'm discussing this too. Like here's what I'll say about assault weapons, and then because I know we're wrapping up here.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. My thing that a very interesting argument that I've heard, and it's, so you've brought up a point, which is like these weapons, they can enable mass murder and they're very efficient at that and everything else. And people are basically like, why would anybody need something that powerful? But then on the other hand, I've heard, if I'm in a place where I need to defend myself, I want the odds stacked unfairly in my favor. And so I'm like, man, we're caught between like two really solid arguments. You know what I mean?
But I do call bullshit on the idea that anybody, not, that we like to do a lot of role playing. Like I think like the kind of pro-gun crowd, and I own guns. I'm not anti-gun, but the real, like the give me liberty or give me death type guys who like have the
cosplay
decals on their car and stuff. Yeah. They are living in a fantasy that, no, I might need to use my assault weapon to defend myself. Mm-hmm. The only way that would come into being is if there's a war in the streets. And I guess I'm just not willing to live in a world where I think that's right around the corner to the point where I need to have this assault weapon. I don't think it's healthy. I think it's like, that's pretty fucked up.
Yeah.
If you think that you need this very dangerous tool because you might need to get in a like rifle fight in the streets.
Right.
Because you're not using it in your house. If people get shot breaking into people's houses, or like at the drugstore trying to rob someone, they get shot all the time. It's never with an AR-15 unless it's a mass shooting. So, you see these videos pop up every once in a while where like brave ex-veteran shoots armed assailant in heroic move. That happens. Like, sure. I'm not trying to demean that, but it's never with like, all right, I'm going to take my AR-15 off my back and like use my rifle. Mm-hmm. It's always a handgun or maybe at home, sometimes a shotgun. But I feel like the AR-15, the arguments of like, I need this for self-defense, it almost always feels a little Civil War-ish to me. It's always like defense of like our county when the tanks roll in.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a little bit of like, all right, buddy, this is like you're living in your make-believe world.
Yeah.
Better go update your K rations in your basement too. Make sure those haven't expired.
Right. For the end times. Well, speaking of end times, a lot of people have predicted that the Safety Act would be the end times. You like that transition?
That was good. The Purge.
Yes, the Purge.
What's the term?
Yeah.
The Safety Act is a terrible law that was poorly written and hastily passed. It is trying to achieve some, I guess, noble goals. It's trying to it's trying to end certain problems that are legit problems.
Yeah.
But it was just such a poorly executed bill. And the biggest thing, as far as I understood it, was bail reform and the end of cash bail. And that's a real thing. I'll never forget being in a traffic courtroom and seeing a woman led in by the sheriff who had her court date that day. And she had the belly chains on, the leather belt around the waist with her hands handcuffed, secured to her waist, and she had the leg shackles on, and she waddled in, and it was like she had like a $200 bond and didn't have the $200 to pay it. And so all the people in the courtroom that did have the $200 just walked in their khakis and watched this woman shackled. And so that sucked. That is a problem. Like, we should never have people who are locked up and literally manacled like Hannibal Lecter because they can't come up with $200.
Right.
Because that's not a finding of, there's no dangerousness element there. It's just like, we're punishing you for being poor.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that should be fixed. But the Safety Act is not going to fix that, because, I mean, it might fix that. Maybe that situation that I observed that one time wouldn't have happened under the Safety Act, but it's going to shift all of that over incarceration just to another side of things. So, I'm touching, like, barely scratching the surface of what it does. A lot of what it does, you have the right to a hearing. The judge needs to make findings about your dangerousness, and then it says, well, if it doesn't go your way, you can immediately appeal it to the appellate court. And I think that the estimate was this was going to create another 5,500 appeals a year, something like that. It's like something that someone wrote on the back of a napkin when they were drunk, and it became a law.
Yeah.
And so all of these judges who are going to have to be enforcing this, and public defenders and prosecutors and private attorneys like me, come December 31st of this past year, when the Supreme Court announced that it was staying the bill or the act, all of us were like, holy shit, here we go. No one knows what to expect. This is going to be crazy, because there were still so many unanswered questions, and there still are. So we'll have to see what they do.
Gotcha. Well, one of the things you mentioned, and then we can close the show, that I feel like was a big fear of people was, will dangerous people just be like, will the doors just open and all of a sudden people are walking out of the prison? And so one of the things that you mentioned that I felt like most people aren't aware of, and I've heard it as a counterpoint to this concern. So first of all, let me air the concern. The concern is, this law will allow pedophiles to run free and blah, 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 blah. But one of the things you just mentioned, which I hear as a counterpoint to that concern, is there is a hearing, and it's with a judge, and they determine your danger to society, for lack of better words.
It's people worried about the purge. There's just nothing to that.
Okay.
It's all still the same judges making the same decisions whether to release someone or not. Mm-hmm. It's just the difference now is, instead of saying how much money do you have to post to get out, it's now, do you get out or do you not get out? Gotcha. It's just a binary choice now.
Yeah.
And so if there's a dangerous pedophile who, like, is obviously dangerous, and he's, kidnapped kids or whatever, what would happen right now, as long as the act is stayed, and what would have happened prior, is the judge would say, how much can you post? And maybe the defense attorney would say, my client has $5,000 he can post to get out. And the judge would say, I'm setting your bond at $1 million. So the guy's detained. Mm-hmm. He's not going to come up with $100,000 to get out, or say $5 million, which would require, $500,000 to get out. That's what the judge would do now. And under the Safety Act, the judge just says, you're not getting out. Mm. That's the only difference. It's the only thing that's changed. And so,
even if they had that amount of money,
if Elon Musk gets detained in Illinois under the Safety Act, and the judge finds that he's a danger, the judge just says, you're not getting out. Now, there were some laws, there are some offenses where that don't require automatic detention. And that was what supported the whole purge narrative. It's like, second degree murder, you're not automatically detained. Really what that meant was the judge can just say, you're not automatically detained, but you're detained because I've found that you should be detained.
Gotcha.
That's the only thing. But who knows? I don't even know if any of that stuff's going to apply. I don't even know if the Safety Act's going to make it. Because the unconstitutionality argument is premised on like the foundation of the Safety Act, which is, there's part of the Illinois Constitution says all defendants shall have bail. And one of the arguments against the Safety Act is like, you can't eliminate bail because the Constitution says you need bail.
Right.
One of them is like whether the bill was read 3 times. I think maybe I'm thinking of the assault weapons ban. They're starting to blur together, but one of them was like, there's like a formal introduction of the bill you have to do. And they're saying you didn't do that. So if that wins, it's like the whole thing's in a crapper.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's good that we just scratched the surface, because it sounds like the state has only scratched the surface, and that we'll have much more to discuss on these topics. So with that, I'm going to call it a wrap. Evan, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. And folks, I hope you found value in this episode of the podcast. We'll definitely sit down with Evan again in the future. Take care.
Appreciate it, Cole. Thank you.